In the glittering, unforgiving heart of 1818 London, a single misstep could mean absolute social ruin. For Miss Eleanor Ainsworth, a companion with no fortune and even fewer prospects, that misstep was a splash of crimson wine on the gleaming black leather boots of the most powerful and unapproachable man in England, Duke Alistair Beaumont of Blackwood. The gasps of the surrounding ballroom were sharp enough to cut glass. The music faltered. Everyone held their breath, expecting her immediate and brutal banishment from society. Instead, the notoriously cold Duke looked down at the stain, then up at her, and a slow, unreadable smile graced his lips. He uttered 7 words that would shatter her world and bind her to a fate she never imagined. "Then I suppose you must marry me." The ballroom of Lord and Lady Ashworth was a galaxy of shimmering silks, glittering diamonds, and calculated smiles. For Eleanor Ainsworth, it was a battlefield. Her role was simple, yet perilous: to remain 3 paces behind her employer, the Dowager Countess of Danbury, to laugh politely at jokes that weren't funny, and to be as unobtrusive as a piece of furniture. At 22, with her father's untimely death having left the family destitute, this was her lot. She was a ghost in a world of vibrant, living aristocrats. Her charge, the Dowager, was a creature of sharp opinions and even sharper elbows. "Eleanor, fetch me a glass of the claret," she commanded, her voice a reedy whisper that somehow carried over the orchestra's waltz. "And do try not to look so morose. One would think you were attending a funeral, not the event of the season." Eleanor murmured her assent and slipped through the throng of dancers. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, none of which actually saw her. They saw the plain brown dress, a hand-me-down from a more fortunate cousin, and the simple, unadorned twist of her chestnut hair. They saw a companion, a nobody. As she navigated the crowd, a sudden surge from the dance floor pushed a portly lord directly into her path. She sidestepped deftly, but the tray in her hand, bearing a single, full glass of deep red wine, tilted precariously. She caught her balance, a sigh of relief on her lips, only to turn and find herself face to face with a wall of black, superfine wool. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. It was him, Duke Alistair Beaumont of Blackwood. He was a man carved from shadow and ice, taller than any other man in the room, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was impossibly wealthy, impossibly powerful, and according to every rumor whispered behind a fan, impossibly cold. He never smiled, never danced, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. He was a legend, a myth, and he was staring down at her with an expression of utter indifference. In that frozen moment of panic, her hand trembled. A single perfect drop of crimson claret fell from the rim of the glass. It landed with an almost silent splash upon the immaculate, mirror-like shine of his left boot. The world stopped. A collective gasp rippled through the nearest guests. The Dowager, seeing the tableau from across the room, looked as though she might faint from sheer mortification. For Eleanor, a cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized her. This was it. This was the end of her position, her reputation, and any hope she had of securing a respectable future for her mother and younger sister. She finally found her voice, a stammering, horrified whisper. "Your Grace, I am so dreadfully sorry. I don't know what to say. It was an accident, I assure you." She fumbled for the small handkerchief tucked into her sleeve, a useless, flimsy piece of cotton against the dark, spreading stain. She knelt, a gesture of complete and utter humiliation, intending to dab at the mess. "Do not," a low, resonant voice commanded. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak, and the sound vibrated through her. She froze, her hand hovering just above his boot. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his. He was still looking down at her, but something in his expression had shifted. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by a flicker of something else. Curiosity? Amusement? He extended a hand, not to help her up, but to stop her. A handkerchief will do no good. The damage is done. "I will pay for the cleaning, Your Grace," she blurted out, knowing how ridiculous she sounded. Her yearly wages would likely not cover the cost of polishing his boots, let alone replacing them. "Or for new ones. Whatever you wish." A strange silence descended upon their small circle. The Duke's gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were solving a complex puzzle. He looked at the wine on his boot, then at her terrified, upturned face. Then, the impossible happened. The corner of his mouth twitched, and a slow, deliberate smile spread across his features. It was not a warm smile. It was sharp and calculating, and it sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Before the stunned onlookers, Duke Alistair Beaumont of Blackwood spoke again, his voice clear and carrying in the sudden hush. "New boots will not suffice, Miss Ainsworth," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Eleanor Ainsworth." "Miss Ainsworth," he repeated, the name tasting foreign and strange on his lips. "Such a public slight requires a more significant form of restitution. Yes, I think a grander gesture is in order." He paused, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. "Then I suppose you must marry me." The Duke's words hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. Laughter, sharp and incredulous, rippled through the crowd before it died away, strangled by the look of utter seriousness on the Duke's face. He was not joking. The man who never smiled had just made the most ludicrous proposal in the history of the London season, and he looked as though he were discussing the weather. Eleanor remained on her knees, staring up at him, certain she was in the grip of a fever dream. "Pardon me, Your Grace," she stammered. "I must have misheard you." "My hearing is impeccable, Miss Ainsworth, and I suspect yours is as well," he said coolly, his smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He offered her his hand. This time, it was an invitation to stand. Numbly, she placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm and surprisingly warm. He pulled her to her feet with an effortless strength that left her feeling weightless and dizzy. He turned to the gawking crowd, his voice now laced with steel. "The ballroom has grown rather stuffy. I believe Miss Ainsworth and I require some air." It was not a request. It was a royal decree. The sea of aristocrats parted for them, as if by magic. Alistair did not release her hand. He kept it tucked firmly in the crook of his arm, leading her from the ballroom, past a thunderstruck dowager, and out onto a deserted stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The cool night air was a shock to Eleanor's heated skin. The distant sounds of the orchestra were a strange counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. "Your Grace," she began, pulling her hand away once they were alone. This is absurd. It must be some cruel jest." "I do not jest, Miss Ainsworth," he stated, turning to face her. The moonlight carved his features into stark, handsome lines. "I am in need of a wife. You are in need of... well, let us say you are in need of an alternative to your current station. I am offering one." Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing. This made no sense. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He could have any woman in England, any blue-blooded, diamond-dusted debutante he desired. Why her, a penniless companion who had just humiliated herself by staining his boots? "Why?" she asked, the single word filled with a universe of confusion. "Why me?" "Because you are perfect," he said, with no trace of romance in his tone. It was a statement of fact. "You have no significant family to meddle in my affairs. You have no fortune, so you will be beholden to me. You are intelligent enough to understand an arrangement, yet you are not so deeply embedded in the ton that you have your own complicated alliances. And you are here now. It is efficient." Efficient. He spoke of marriage as if it were a business transaction. Eleanor felt a surge of indignation. "You can't be serious. You would marry a complete stranger based on a list of convenient qualifications?" "It is precisely because you are a stranger that it will work," he countered, his stormy eyes never leaving hers. "I have no interest in a love match, Miss Ainsworth. I require a duchess, a hostess for my homes, a woman to bear the title and fulfill the social obligations I despise. In return, you will receive a title, wealth beyond your imagining, and security for the rest of your life. You will never have to serve another demanding dowager or worry about the cost of a new pair of shoes. Your family will be provided for." He paused, letting the last part sink in. He had done his research, or he was an incredibly astute guesser. The thought of her mother and sister, living in their cramped, rented rooms, struggling to make ends meet. It was a constant, aching weight on her soul. He was offering to lift that weight. "This is a contract, Miss Ainsworth. Nothing more," he continued. "You would be my duchess in name and in public. In private, we would lead separate lives. I will not trouble your bedchamber, and I expect you to afford me the same courtesy." The cold, clinical nature of his proposal was both insulting and, in a strange way, a relief. He was not asking for her heart. He was asking for her name. But could she do it? Could she chain herself to this cold, calculating stranger, even for the sake of her family? "People will talk," she whispered, thinking of the scandal. "They will say you have lost your mind." "Let them talk," he said with a dismissive shrug. "Their gossip is meaningless to me. I will announce our engagement tomorrow. I will say I was struck by your spirit and have been admiring you from afar. It's a ridiculous fiction, but it is the sort of fiction this society adores. They will believe it because they have to. No one will dare question my choice." He was right. His power was absolute. He could rewrite reality with a single pronouncement. Eleanor looked out at the dark, manicured gardens. Her whole life had been a series of closed doors. She had dreamed of love, of a partnership with a kind man, of a life filled with warmth and affection. This offer was the antithesis of all her dreams. It was a gilded cage, a prison of wealth and titles, but it was also a lifeline. It was a chance to save her family, to escape the daily humiliations of her existence. I need to think," she said, her voice barely audible. "You have until dawn," Alistair replied, his tone final. "A carriage will be sent to your employer's residence at 7 o'clock. If you are in it, I will have my answer. If you are not, I will assume you prefer your life as it is, and we shall never speak of this again. I will even forget the matter of my boot." He gave a slight, formal bow, turned on his heel, and walked back into the glittering ballroom, leaving Eleanor alone on the terrace with the moon, the stars, and the weight of an impossible choice. Eleanor did not sleep. She spent the night staring at the ceiling of her small, cold attic room at the dowager's residence, the Duke's words echoing in her mind. A contract. Separate lives. Your family will be provided for. Each phrase was a push and a pull, a temptation and a warning. By the time the first grey light of dawn seeped through her window, she had made her decision. It was not a choice for herself, but for her mother and sister, Sarah. She would step into the gilded cage. At precisely 7 o'clock, a sleek black carriage bearing a ducal crest of a wolf's head appeared on the street below. Her heart pounded as she descended the stairs, carrying a small, worn satchel containing all her worldly possessions. The dowager met her in the foyer, her face a mask of bewildered fury. "What is the meaning of this, Eleanor? The Duke's footman delivered a note. He has purchased your contract of employment from me. He speaks of an engagement. You will be the laughingstock of London." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, her voice calmer than she felt. "But I will be a wealthy laughingstock, and my family will be secure. Thank you for your employment, Lady Danbury." For the first time, Eleanor walked out the front door without looking back. The carriage ride to Blackwood House, the Duke's London residence, was a journey into another world. The city shifted from modest townhouses to opulent mansions. When the carriage stopped before a towering edifice of pale stone, guarded by immense iron gates, Eleanor felt a fresh wave of intimidation. Alistair was waiting for her in a vast, dark wood library that smelled of old leather and beeswax. He was not dressed for a ball, but in a simple white shirt and dark riding breeches, and he looked younger, more approachable, yet no less imposing. "You came," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did," she confirmed, clutching her satchel. "On the condition that my family is cared for. I want a house for them, in the country, and a stipend that ensures they never want for anything." "It is already done," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I have purchased a cottage for them in Hertfordshire, and settled an annuity in your mother's name. A letter was dispatched to her this morning, explaining the situation in terms I believe she will find acceptable." Just like that. With a wave of his hand, he had solved the greatest problem of her life. The sheer power of it was staggering. The weeks that followed were a blur. Alistair was true to his word. The announcement of their engagement in the Times sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. As he had predicted, the story concocted was one of a whirlwind, secret romance. The reclusive Duke finally captivated by an unassuming beauty. It was so preposterous that society, desperate for a scandal, devoured it whole. Eleanor was moved from her attic room into a suite of chambers at Blackwood House that was larger than the entire floor she had lived on with her family. A lady's maid named Anna, a kind, middle-aged woman with sympathetic eyes, was assigned to her. Gowns of silk and velvet appeared in her wardrobes. A jeweller arrived with velvet trays of diamonds, sapphires, and pearls for her to choose from. It was a fairy tale, but a cold one. Alistair was a constant, yet distant, presence. He instructed her on etiquette, on the names and histories of the powerful families she would have to know. He was a patient, if detached, teacher. They took meals together, speaking of neutral topics like politics or literature. There was no warmth, no affection, just the cool, polite respect of two business partners. The true trial was facing society. Her first outing as the Duke's fiancée was to a garden party at the home of a viscount. As she walked in on Alistair's arm, a hush fell over the crowd. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. Whispers followed them like the rustle of dry leaves. "That's her. She's so plain." I heard she trapped him, threw herself at his feet. Blackwood must have taken leave of his senses. The most venomous glares came from a woman of breathtaking beauty, with hair the colour of spun gold and eyes as sharp and blue as ice. Anna had warned Eleanor about her. Lady Isabel Finch, the woman everyone had assumed would one day be the Duchess of Blackwood. Lady Isabel approached them, her smile a slash of crimson against her pale skin. "Your Grace," she purred, ignoring Eleanor completely. "You have certainly given the ton a surprise. One must admire your unique taste." Before Eleanor could react, Alistair's grip on her arm tightened slightly. "Lady Isabel," he said, his voice flat and cold, "allow me to introduce my fiancée, Miss Ainsworth. I find her taste and her character to be impeccable. I am certain you will come to agree." The dismissal was absolute. Lady Isabel's smile faltered, and a flash of pure hatred sparked in her eyes as she looked at Eleanor. It was a declaration of war. Later that evening, as Eleanor was preparing for bed, she looked at her reflection in the grand, gilt-edged mirror. She was wearing a nightgown of the finest silk, a string of pearls still cool against her neck. She was living a life she couldn't have dreamed of, but she had never felt more alone. The girl in the mirror looked like a stranger, a doll dressed up to play the part of a duchess. She had gained the world, but she was terrified she had lost herself in the bargain. The wedding day arrived with the pomp and circumstance befitting a duke. The ceremony was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, the church overflowing with the cream of English society, all of them there to witness the culmination of the season's most baffling romance. Eleanor felt as though she were watching a play with herself in the leading role. Anna dressed her in a gown of ivory satin, so heavy it felt like armor. The Beaumont diamonds, cold and brilliant, were clasped around her neck. As her carriage drew up to the church, she caught sight of her mother and Sarah in the crowd. Their faces were a mixture of awe and anxiety, and the sight of them both bolstered her resolve and broke her heart. This was for them. Alistair was waiting at the altar. He looked magnificent and remote in his dark formal wear, a stranger she was about to bind herself to for life. He took her hand as she reached him, his fingers cool and steady around hers. They turned to face the Archbishop, and the ceremony began. She spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, the words, "to love, honor, and obey," feeling like a betrayal of the cold, loveless contract they had agreed upon. When Alistair spoke his vows, his voice resonated through the hallowed church, each word delivered with perfect, emotionless precision. It was a performance, and he was the master of it. When he slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger, a jolt, like a spark of lightning, shot up her arm. It was the first time they had touched since the night on the terrace. His thumb brushed against her skin for a fleeting second, and the unexpected warmth of the contact made her breath catch. For a flicker of a moment, as he looked down at their joined hands, she thought she saw something in his eyes, a shadow of regret, a hint of vulnerability, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You may kiss the bride," the Archbishop intoned. Alistair turned to her. The world seemed to fade into a blur. There was only his face, his stormy eyes searching hers. He leaned in and his lips brushed against hers. It was not a passionate kiss, nor was it entirely chaste. It was brief, firm, and shockingly gentle. It tasted of mystery and unspoken promises, a silent acknowledgement of the strange pact that now bound them. The reception at Blackwood House was a grand, impersonal affair. Eleanor stood by his side for hours, accepting congratulations from people whose names she instantly forgot, smiling until her face ached. Lady Isabel Finch was there, a viper in emerald green, her eyes following Eleanor's every move. Finally, long after midnight, the last guest departed. The great house fell silent. The performance was over. A housemaid led Eleanor to the Duchess's chambers, a suite even more opulent than the one she had occupied as a fiancée. Anna was there to help her out of her heavy gown. "You were wonderful, Your Grace," Anna said softly, her kindness a balm on Eleanor's frayed nerves. "Thank you, Anna. Please call me Eleanor when we are alone." "As you wish, Eile." "Your Grace," Anna corrected herself with a small smile. Once she was in her nightgown, Anna curtsied and left, closing the door softly behind her. Eleanor was alone. She walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. The words felt hollow. A soft knock came at the door connecting her chambers to the Duke's. Her heart leaped into her throat. She had assumed he would honor their agreement and leave her be. "Come in," she called, her voice trembling slightly. Alistair entered. He had removed his jacket and cravat, his shirt open at the collar. He looked less like a duke and more like a man. He held 2 glasses of wine. "I thought we should toast our successful enterprise," he said, his voice low. He handed her a glass. "To the arrangement," she said, raising her glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "To the arrangement," he echoed, and they both drank. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. "Your chambers are to your satisfaction?" he asked, a strangely formal question for a husband to ask his wife on their wedding night. "They are magnificent," she replied. "More than I could ever need." He nodded, looking around the room as if he were seeing it for the first time. "This was my mother's suite," he said, his voice softening, almost imperceptibly. She loved these rooms. It was the first personal detail he had ever shared with her. It was a tiny crack in the icy wall he kept around himself. "She must have been a wonderful woman," Eleanor found herself saying. A shadow passed over his face. "She was." He drained his glass and placed it on a nearby table. "Well," he said, his formal tone returning, "I will not keep you. I trust you will find everything you need. Your maid knows to answer any request." He turned to leave, and Eleanor felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to stop him. "Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time. He stopped, his back to her, but he did not turn around. "Thank you," she said softly. For my family." He stood motionless for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Good night, Eleanor." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving her alone in the opulent room with the ghost of a gentle kiss and the lingering scent of his wine. The marriage was a sham, but the man, she was beginning to realize, was far more complex than she had ever imagined. 2 days after the wedding, they left London for the Duke's ancestral seat, Blackwood Manor. If the London house was a symbol of his power, the manor was the heart of his history. It rose from the rolling green countryside like a Gothic giant, a magnificent, sprawling estate of grey stone, ivy-clad towers, and hundreds of mullioned windows that glittered in the sun like watchful eyes. It was breathtakingly beautiful. But as they drew closer, Eleanor felt a palpable sense of melancholy hanging over the place. It was a house that held its breath, a house that harbored secrets. The staff, led by a stern, unsmiling housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, lined up to greet their new Duchess. They were respectful, but distant, their gazes wary. Eleanor understood. To them she was an interloper, a stranger of common birth who had somehow ensnared their duke. Alistair was different here. In London, he was a powerful figure in a sea of powerful men. Here, he was a king in his own realm. The weight of his lineage seemed to settle more heavily on his shoulders. He became even more remote, spending his days locked in his study or riding out across the vast estate alone. He was courteous during their shared dinners, but his thoughts were clearly 1,000 miles away. Left to her own devices, Eleanor began to explore. The manor was a labyrinth of grand halls, dusty libraries, and endless corridors lined with the portraits of Beaumont ancestors, their painted eyes following her every move. She felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was not her own. Her attempts to assume the duties of a duchess were met with polite but firm resistance from Mrs. Gable. "His Grace has always preferred things done a certain way, Your Grace," the housekeeper would say, effectively shutting down any suggestion Eleanor made. She was the Duchess, but she had no authority, no purpose. One rainy afternoon, seeking refuge from her own loneliness, Eleanor found herself in a long, disused gallery in the east wing. The furniture was draped in white cloths, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. It was here she found it, a single portrait, unlike the others. It was not of a stern-looking duke or a bejeweled duchess. It was of a young woman, no older than 16, with Alistair's black hair and a vibrant, joyful smile. But it was her eyes that captivated Eleanor. They were the same stormy sea grey as Alistair's. But where his were filled with shadows, hers danced with light. There was no nameplate beneath the painting. It was simply a portrait of a forgotten girl. Later that evening at dinner, Eleanor decided to breach the wall of silence between them. "I was exploring the East Gallery today," she said, her voice sounding overly loud in the cavernous dining hall. "I found a beautiful portrait of a young woman." Alistair, who had been staring into his wine glass, froze. The fork in his hand stilled. He slowly raised his head, and his eyes were chips of ice. "That wing is kept closed for a reason." "I apologize," she said quickly, taken aback by the venom in his tone. "The door was unlocked. I was just curious. She looked so much like you. Was she your sister?" The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. For a moment, she thought he would not answer. When he did, his voice was a low, ragged whisper. "Her name was Lillian, and you will not speak of her again. Do you understand?" The raw pain in his voice was so profound that it stunned her. This was the source of the house's sadness. This was the heart of his frozen grief. "Yes," she whispered back. "I understand." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the stone floor. "I have work to attend to." He left without another word, leaving her alone at the massive table, the food on her plate untouched. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The image of Lillian's smiling face was burned into her mind, juxtaposed with the anguish she had seen in Alistair's eyes. The house was no longer just a house, it was a mausoleum. The Duke was not just a cold man. He was a man consumed by a sorrow so deep he had sealed off entire sections of his home and his heart to contain it. Driven by a need she didn't understand. Pity, curiosity, a strange sense of loyalty to the man whose name she bore. She lit a candle and slipped out of her room. She made her way back to the East Gallery, the candlelight flickering against the portraits of the dead. She stood before Lillian's portrait again. In the wavering light, the girl's smile seemed sadder, her eyes filled with a tragic knowledge. Eleanor felt a deep, aching sympathy for this girl she had never met, and for the brother she had left behind. As she raised her candle to get a better look, the light caught on something near the base of the heavy, gilded frame. Tucked deep behind the canvas was a small, folded piece of yellowed paper. Her hands trembling, Eleanor carefully worked it free. It was a letter. The ink faded with time. She unfolded it, her heart pounding. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. It began with 2 words that sent a chill down her spine. "Dearest Isabel." The letter was from Lillian. It was dated nearly 5 years prior and was written in the breathless, enthusiastic prose of a 16-year-old girl. It spoke of horses, of a new gown, and of her deep affection for her dearest friend and future sister, Isabel Finch. Alistair is so serious these days, but he smiles when you are near. He pretends not to, but I see it. You will make him so happy, Isabel. I know you are the only one who can truly understand his heart. Eleanor read the words over and over, the candlelight trembling in her hand. Lady Isabel Finch had not simply been a hopeful candidate for the title of Duchess. She had been Lilian's best friend. She had been close to the family, close to Alistair. This explained the pure, personal venom in her hatred for Eleanor. She had not just lost a title. She had lost what she believed was her rightful place in a family she was already a part of. But it also raised a darker question. What had happened? What had shattered that bond so completely and plunged Alistair into a grief so profound he couldn't even bear to hear his sister's name? The discovery of the letter shifted something inside Eleanor. Her life at Blackwood was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding. She began to watch, to listen. She spoke to the older servants, not asking direct questions about Lilian, but about the history of the manor, about their lives. She learned that the East Wing had been shuttered after the accident, that the Duke had dismissed nearly half the staff from that time, that he had not been seen to smile in 5 years. Her quiet persistence began to thaw the icy demeanour of the staff. Anna, her lady's maid, started offering small tidbits of information. Mrs. Gable, the stern housekeeper, watched her with a new, appraising look in her eyes. Eleanor was no longer just an interloper. She was the Duchess, and she was beginning to care for the house and its master in a way no one had expected. A crisis arrived in the form of a letter from Alistair's solicitor in London. One of his key shipping investments was on the verge of collapse, threatened by a competitor who seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of Alistair's business dealings. The financial loss would be catastrophic. Alistair locked himself in his study for 2 days, emerging only for meals, his face pale and drawn. The strain was visible, the impenetrable mask of control cracking at the edges. On the 3rd evening, Eleanor gathered her courage and knocked on his study door. "Enter!" he barked, his voice strained. She found him hunched over a desk, littered with ledgers and letters, a half-empty bottle of brandy at his elbow. He looked up, his eyes weary. "What is it, Eleanor?" "I want to help," she said simply. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Help? How can you possibly help? This is a world of finance and betrayal you know nothing about." "My father was a merchant before he lost everything," she countered, stepping further into the room. "He taught me how to read a ledger. He taught me to look for patterns, for things that don't belong. Perhaps a fresh set of eyes." He stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. He was exhausted, cornered. Finally, with a sigh of defeat, he gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Very well. Do your worst." For the next several hours they worked in silence. Eleanor meticulously went through the correspondence, the shipping manifests, the financial records. Alistair watched her, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging respect. She was quick, intelligent, and her observations were astute. It was nearly dawn when she found it. A small discrepancy in a customs report from a year ago, followed by a similar one 6 months later. Alone, they were meaningless. Together, they suggested a pattern of information being leaked, of cargo being subtly redirected, and the name of the agent who signed off on both reports was a man she knew Alistair had dismissed for drunkenness 2 years prior. "This man, John Smithers," she said, her voice quiet. "Did he have a family?" Alistair frowned. "A wife, I believe." "Why?" "And did he have any particular friends?" she pressed. He thought for a moment, then his eyes widened in sudden, dawning horror. He was a cousin, a distant cousin of Lady Isabel's father. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Isabel Finch, scorned and furious, was not just attacking Eleanor socially. She was systematically trying to ruin Alistair financially, using old connections and a thirst for revenge. This was not the act of a jilted lover. This was a calculated, vicious campaign of destruction. Alistair stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the rising sun. "I have been a fool," he said, his voice raw. "So consumed with the past, I could not see the enemy right in front of me." He turned to look at her, and for the first time, the wall between them crumbled. In his eyes, she saw not the cold Duke, but a man betrayed, a man who was vulnerable. "You have done me a great service tonight, Eleanor," he said softly. "More than you know." In that moment, standing in the dusty, candlelit study as a new day began, they were not a duke and a duchess, bound by a contract. They were simply Alistair and Eleanor, allies against a common foe. And for Eleanor, a dangerous, unexpected feeling began to take root in her heart. A fierce, protective loyalty to her husband. Armed with the knowledge of Isabel's treachery, Alistair moved with swift, ruthless efficiency. He dispatched agents to London, and within a week they had irrefutable proof of the conspiracy. Smithers had been paid handsomely by Lord Finch, Isabel's father, to leak shipping information to a rival company in which Finch himself was a silent partner. Ruin was averted. The enemy was exposed. But the victory felt hollow. The discovery had opened a door to the past that Alistair could no longer keep shut. The trust he had once placed in Isabel, the friendship she had shared with his sister, it had all been a lie, twisted into a weapon against him. He became even more withdrawn, the silence in the manor growing deeper, heavier. Eleanor found him one afternoon, standing in the East Gallery, in front of Lillian's portrait, his hand resting on the frame. He did not seem to notice her arrival. "It was her favorite spot," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She would sit on the window seat for hours, sketching the gardens." Eleanor came to stand beside him, her presence a quiet offering of comfort. She did not speak. She simply waited. "They were inseparable," he continued, as if speaking to himself. "Lillian and Isabel. They shared every secret. I thought Isabel loved her. Loved us." He finally turned to look at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a pain so raw it was like a physical wound. "You wanted to know what happened to her, to Lillian. It is time you knew. It is time someone knew the truth." He led her out of the gallery and into the gardens. They walked in silence to a secluded, overgrown corner of the estate, where a small, weathered stone bench sat beneath a weeping willow. "We were here," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The three of us. Lillian, Isabel, and I. It was the day before Lillian's 17th birthday. She was full of life. More life than anyone I have ever known." He paused, gathering himself. "Lillian and I had a foolish argument about a horse she wanted to ride that I deemed too spirited for her. We exchanged sharp words. I was overprotective, and she was headstrong. Isabel took Lillian's side, calling me a tyrant." He let out a ragged breath. "The last thing I ever said to my sister was in anger. To prove her point, to defy me, Lillian ran off toward the old stable block near the cliffs. Isabel went with her. I was angry, so I let them go. I told myself I would apologize at dinner." His voice broke. But there was no dinner. An hour later, Isabel came running back, screaming. There had been an accident. Lillian's horse had been spooked. It had thrown her near the cliff's edge. By the time I got there, it was too late. She was gone. Tears were now streaming freely down his face, and Eleanor's heart ached for him. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. He gripped her hand like a drowning man. The official story was that it was a tragic riding accident, he choked out. But Isabel told me the truth later that night, sworn to secrecy. She said Lillian confessed to her just moments before she ran off. She was going to meet a man. A secret suitor. A stable hand I had dismissed weeks before for theft. Isabel claimed Lillian was so distraught over my disapproval that she was planning to elope with him. The fall, she insisted, may not have been an accident. She hinted that my sister may have taken her own life in a fit of despair. Eleanor gasped, her mind reeling. I believed her, Alistair whispered, his face a mask of agony. I buried my sister believing she had died because of a secret shame I knew nothing about, because of a fight I had started. The guilt. It has consumed me for 5 years. I closed this wing. I shut out the world. I shut out her memory, because I blamed myself. And Isabel, she was the only one who knew my secret shame. She used it to keep me close, to manipulate my grief. She always knew just what to say to twist the knife. Eleanor's mind flashed to the letter. Dearest Isabel, Alistair is so serious. You will make him so happy. It was the letter of an innocent girl, not one on the verge of a scandalous elopement. Nothing made sense. Alistair, Eleanor said, her voice firm, pulling him back from the edge of his despair. I don't believe it. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with confusion. What? I don't believe Lillian would do that. And I don't believe Isabel was telling you the truth, she said, her conviction growing. She has already proven she is capable of profound deceit. Why would this be any different? She told you a story that would cripple you with guilt, making you dependent on her silence and her comfort. She has been feeding on your pain for years. A flicker of doubt, the first in 5 years, entered Alistair's eyes. The version of events he had accepted for so long was being challenged. The foundations of his grief were beginning to crack. There is more to this story, Eleanor insisted, her grip on his hand tightening. And we are going to find it. For Lillian. And for you. For the first time since she had met him, Alistair looked at her, not as a convenience, not as an ally, but as a beacon of hope in a darkness he had thought was endless. He had married her to create a barrier against the world, but she had just become the one person capable of breaking down his walls. Eleanor's words ignited a new purpose in Alistair. For 5 years, he had been a prisoner of Isabel's narrative. Now, he was a man seeking the truth. Together, they began to piece together the events of that terrible day, not as they had been told, but as they might have actually happened. The key was the stable hand Lillian had supposedly planned to elope with. Alistair, through his network of agents, managed to locate the man, Thomas, now living a quiet life as a blacksmith in a northern village. Alistair and Eleanor travelled there together, unannounced. They found Thomas in his forge, a solid man with honest eyes and work-roughened hands. At the sight of the Duke of Blackwood, fear and surprise warred on his face. "Your Grace," he stammered, bowing awkwardly. "We are not here to cause you trouble, Thomas," Alistair said, his voice steady. "We are here to ask you about my sister, Lillian." Thomas's face softened with a sad nostalgia. "Lady Lillian. She was the kindest soul at the manor. Always had a friendly word. She loved the horses more than anyone." "Were you in love with her?" Eleanor asked gently. Thomas looked shocked, then shook his head vehemently. "Good heavens, no, Your Grace. I mean, she was a fine lady. But I knew my place. Besides, I was already courting my Mary then. Lady Lillian knew. She used to tease me about it. Alistair's face went pale. I was told she was planning to run away with you, that she was meeting you on the cliffs the day she died. Thomas's brow furrowed in confusion. Meet me? Your Grace, that's impossible. You dismissed me nearly a month before her accident. I was already here, in this village, setting up my forge. My wife, Mary, she can attest to it. The entire village can. The lie that had poisoned Alistair's life for 5 years was shattered in a single, simple statement. There was no elopement. There was no secret suitor. It was all a monstrous fabrication. Then why? Alistair asked, the words catching in his throat. Why would Isabel lie? And then Thomas's eyes filled with a distant, troubled memory. There was something odd, though, he said slowly. The week before I was let go. Lady Isabel, she offered me a great deal of money to leave the country. She said Lady Lillian had developed an unseemly infatuation with me, and that it was best for everyone if I disappeared. I refused, of course. It wasn't true. And then, a few days later, a silver locket went missing from your mother's jewel box. It was found in my room. I swore I didn't take it, but no one believed me. I was dismissed. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Isabel, seeing a teenage crush, or perhaps even just a kind friendship between Lillian and the handsome stable hand, had become consumed with jealousy. She hadn't wanted to save Lillian from an infatuation. She had wanted to remove a perceived rival for Lillian's affection and attention. She had framed Thomas to get rid of him. Alistair, Eleanor said, her voice filled with dawning horror as she pictured the scene. Lillian must have found out. She must have discovered that Isabel framed Thomas. That's what your argument was about. Not a horse. It was about Isabel. Lillian was going to confront her, to expose her. And Isabel followed her to the cliffs to stop her. Whether Lillian's fall was a tragic accident during a heated argument, or something more sinister, they would never know for sure. But one thing was certain. Isabel Finch had built a throne of lies upon the grave of her supposed best friend and used Alistair's grief as its foundation. They returned to Blackwood Manor as the sun was setting, the truth a heavy but cleansing weight between them. That evening, Alistair didn't go to his own chambers. He knocked on Eleanor's door. When she opened it, he looked at her, his stormy eyes clear for the first time. It was never about a spilled glass of wine, was it? She asked softly. He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his lips. No, I saw you at the ball, before the wine. You were standing alone, and you didn't have that hungry, calculating look that every other woman in the room possessed. You looked real. And when you looked up at me after the accident, you weren't afraid of my title. You were just a person, horrified at having made a mistake. I was so tired of games, of lies. My proposal, it was a mad, desperate impulse to find something, anything, authentic. I had no idea I would find you. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. You saved me, Eleanor, he whispered. You walked into the darkness of my life, and you brought the light. You gave me back my sister. You gave me back myself. You saved me too, Alistair, she whispered back, her heart overflowing. You gave me a home. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not the cold, formal kiss from their wedding day, nor the brief, gentle touch of a stranger. This kiss was filled with 5 years of unspoken grief, with gratitude, with the fierce, brilliant promise of a new beginning. It was a kiss of fire and truth, sealing not a contract, but a vow of love born from the ashes of a terrible lie. In the quiet of the Duchess's chambers, the Duke of Blackwood and his unlikely Duchess finally began their life together, not as partners in an arrangement, but as partners in everything. From a clumsy accident in a glittering ballroom to the unearthing of a dark, 5-year-old secret, Eleanor and Alistair's story reminds us that the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the most beautiful and profound destinations. Theirs was a journey that began as a cold contract, but was forged into an unbreakable love through trust, courage, and the healing power of truth. They prove that true partnership isn't about a perfect start, but about facing the darkness together and choosing to find the light. If you were captivated by the drama and romance of the Duke and his Duchess, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with a friend who loves a grand romance with a twist, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales of destiny, secrets, and love against all odds. What was your favorite moment in their story? The shocking proposal, the discovery in the library, or the final revelation? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.